Of course, some of you remember the late great comedian Rodney Dangerfield, who made a pretty handsome living off the phrase, "I get no respect." And with that sort of characteristic tug of his collar and those bulgy eyes and the way he sort of nervously pranced around, he'd rattle off one-liner after one-liner. "I get no respect," he'd say. "I tell you, when I was a kid, I knew all about rejection. When I was born, the doctor, he came out of the waiting room and said to my father, 'I'm sorry, we did everything we could,' but he still pulled through. My mother, she had morning sickness after I was born. Boy, have I known rejection. I asked my old man if I could go ice skating on the lake one day, and he told me, 'Wait till it gets warmer.' Once I got lost and I saw a policeman, and so I went over to him to help me find my parents, and I said to him, 'Can you help me find them?' And he said, 'I don't know, kid. There are so many places they could hide.' Even the family dog gave me no respect. When he'd bark at the front door, it wasn't to go out. No, the mutt wanted me to leave." Poor Rodney. You know, the reason why I suppose his shtick works so well, because he was poking fun at a familiar truth. The fact that certain people are simply not given much respect. Women, you know what I'm talking about. I read an interesting article this past week about female clergy who on average in the U.S. earn 76 cents on every dollar that their male counterparts make. Basically, that works out to about $12,000 less a year. That's significant. Talk about no respect. Of course, members of minorities know what I'm talking about. And so do the poor. And that's why, as a pastor, when someone comes into my office asking for help, the first thing that I want to show them is respect. After all, of all places, shouldn't this be a place where such folk should find respect? Yeah, respect. Everybody wants it. Let's take the 13-year-old boy who said that he carried a gun with him. And when he was asked why, he said, "'Cause if I'm a packin', then I get me some respect." Sure, when you hear an inner city kid saying they've been dissed, then you know that that's shorthand for they've been disrespected, and no one wants to be dissed. And yet there are so many, just like Rodney, who feel that they go through their entire lives without getting any respect, and particularly from sometimes those that are closest to them. No, I'm not going to ask you if there's anyone here who ever was eager to, leave home as a youth because you felt like the people in your own family never respected you. I'm not going to ask you if anyone here couldn't wait to leave high school to get on to college or maybe in the military far, far away from home because you didn't feel like your peers gave you any respect. And I suspect that there are more than a few of you who feel disrespected at work, maybe at home. You feel you're taken advantage of, you're taken for granted. Does anybody here know what I'm talking about? I'm sure that's why Aretha Franklin, a woman of color, sang a song perhaps more than any other for which she is known. She sang, "All I'm asking for is a little respect. Just a little bit. Just a little bit." You all know how to spell it, don't you? Spell it with me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T. And sure, that song struck a chord with a lot of women. But not just with women, but with all of us. Because we all hunger for others to listen to us. We hunger for others to take our ideas seriously. And of course, when we're disrespected, we feel dishonored as a person. So maybe you'll be encouraged by this, folks. Even Jesus had trouble finding respect from those that were closest to him. How about this bizarre statement from Mark near the end of the chapter, near the beginning of Jesus' ministry? We read, when his family heard about Jesus' teachings and his casting out of demons, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. Imagine that. Even Jesus' own family wanted to put him away because they thought he was crazy, out of his mind. Talk about no respect. Then we have our lesson for today from Luke's gospel, in which Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth, and he has the opportunity to teach in the hometown synagogue, his home church. And let's read some of the verses that lead up the backstory to today's lesson. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and unrolling it, he found the place where it had been written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he rolled up the scroll, he gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And you know, folks, as we read further in our lesson, we discover that the home folks were actually impressed at first. Hey, ain't this Joseph's kid? They must have said. You can just see the hometown pride sort of swelling. Yeah, local boy does good. It must have read in the town paper. But then started to come the letters to the editor. Thank God we never have any of those here in the Douglas or Saugatuck newspaper. Yeah, folks started picking at his words. Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And of course the implications of that comment were obvious. That Jesus was making the claim that he was the Messiah, the guy that was to come. Folks became incensed. After all, they'd watched this kid grow up. He was the boy they saw running around and playing games just like all of the other boys in the community. I mean, come on. How could Joseph's son be the Messiah? Truly, maybe he speaks well, and I've heard he's healed a couple of people, but the Messiah? He's just this poor carpenter's kid. And boy, folks, do I know something about what Jesus was up against. I came back and I pastored for over 12 years in the church that I grew up in. And there I literally ministered to those who had diapered my behind when I was a baby. People who had taught me in Sunday school, or who had saw how ornery I was back in youth group in junior high. And now this hayseed from somewhere just outside of town is one of our pastors? Ha! Right. Yeah. Jesus knew quite well what was going on in their minds, and so he said, a prophet is without honor in his own hometown. So is it any surprise that by the time Jesus finished speaking, that we are able to read these amazing words? All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. And they got up and they drove him out of the town and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off of the cliff. And at least you got to say, folks, that it was quite a rousing response to a first sermon by a young preacher in his home church. They were going to kill the guy. And the point is clear. Among his own people, Jesus could get no respect. Just remember that. If you happen to feel that way because Jesus understands. He's been where you are. So with that in mind, how about for just a little bit, we talk about respect. And no, Jesus didn't need to earn people's respect, but you and I do. And having said that, it raises a question, how do you and I become persons who are respected? After all these days, positions, they don't guarantee you respect like they used to. Titles don't. Age doesn't. Experience doesn't. In fact, there's a general loss of respect in our society across the board. Law officers experience it, and teachers experience it, and definitely with our upcoming elections, politicians experience it, and sometimes for good reason. At least we can thank God that none of the politicians around here have given any reason for any kind of disrespect. So it's a good question. How do we become people who are respected? I think actually it's very simple. The first step to being respected by others is to respect yourself. After all, respect is earned and not given. And regardless of your age or your gender or your race or your ethnicity, anyone can earn respect. How? By conducting yourself with dignity, conducting yourself with character. How about I give you this to chew on? Over the past few decades, our society has done a pretty decent job of helping our young people with a sense of self-esteem. We've told our boys and girls that they are wonderful, that they are capable of doing great things, and they are. And studies show that because of that, most young folks have listened to that message. We're doing well with America's youth overall. But you see, there's a distinct difference between self-esteem and self-respect. Self-esteem has to do with how you feel about yourself, while self-respect has to do with the kind of person you really are. Are you a person of honor? Can people trust you? Are you the kind of person who seeks to do the right thing at all times, whether someone is looking or not? Folks, self-respect has to do with your personal code of conduct. Let's take David Brooks's book, The Road to Character. And character, he says, which is really just another word for self-respect, is not won by comparing ourselves with others and saying, boy, ain't I great, but character is instead won by comparing ourselves with the person we used to be. Character, says Brooks, has to do with a perpetual struggle to be a better person. It's being able to say, I'm not everything I should be, but by the grace of God, I'm a better person today than I was yesterday. And folks, just as a point of clarification here, I'm not talking here about some sort of thinly veneered Christian humanism, the kind that was popularized in these days by preachers. Let's take a guy by the name of Joel Osteen. You might have seen him on TV when you were getting ready for church this morning. Before him, there was a guy named Norman Vincent Peale. He popularized it in America with his books on the power of positive thinking. And before him, a French psychologist back in the 1920s, a guy by the name of Émile Coué, kind of brought on the modern movement. He started with the phrase, every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Heard of it? Yeah, using that short little mantra, a sort of optimistic auto-suggestion, he encouraged his patients to repeat it as many as 20 times a day as they worked their way towards their own self-improvement. In fact, over the years, you've probably even heard this power of positive thinking mantra in movies. Let's take the familiar film written by a local boy from our own area here by the name of Patrick Duncan, who went on to write what? Yeah, Mr. Holland's Opus, about a high school music teacher. And in the film, Mr. Holland, played by Richard Dreyfuss, has a son who's deaf. And despite the struggles in their relationship, he ends up using a song written by a little-known artist by the name of John Lennon that's titled Beautiful Boy. And he sings this to his son, and it makes a reference in the song to Emile Coué's mantra in the words, "Before you go to sleep, say a little prayer every day, in every way." It's getting better and better. And folks, that's not to say that every day in every way as Christians that we should not be striving to become better and better. And yet, perhaps the Apostle Paul gives us an assist here as he talks about the sanctification process, the process of becoming more Christ-like. He shouts out one of the great truths of all Scriptures. It's my wife Cindy's favorite verse found in Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through the power of my own positive thinking, right? I heard some laughter. No? Paul shouts, I can do all things through who? Yeah, through Christ who strengthens me. Let's think about how such an example of Paul's great truth works itself out in the daily struggles of our life. Let's take two young couples who attended a certain pastor's church. The two young men in the foursome, they had been longtime best friends. Their wives also got along pretty well. And one of the men, let's call him Bob, was quite a dynamic guy, handsome, athletic, godly, funny, charismatic. While Dan, his best friend, more of an average Joe. Yeah, a nice guy, but not a lady killer. And one day, Dan's wife, she confides to the pastor that she couldn't help but be attracted to Bob. In fact, she said, Bob, And that was the sort of information that the pastor would have just assumed not had. It was a dangerous situation. And then Dan's wife added, of course, Bob would never take advantage of this situation. He's a godly man, and he's Dan's best friend. For that, she said, I really respect him. And so do we. Yeah, like Bob. We can do all things through the power of Christ who strengthens us. Not every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Do you hear what I'm saying? Because of what Christ is doing inside of you, are you becoming a person who can be trusted and respected? And friends, every time a person resists a temptation to betray his or her moral code, they boost, through the power of Christ, their sense of self-respect. Anytime you do or say something simply and solely because it is the right thing to do or say, or refrain from doing or saying something because it is wrong, through Christ, you gain self-respect. And folks, we've taught our kids a lot about self-esteem, but have we modeled for them what it means to have self-respect? Sure, we gain the respect of others, first of all, by respecting ourselves. But then secondly, we gain respect for ourselves by respecting others. Because after all, isn't that how Jesus taught us that we should live? How we should treat others, by respecting all people, regardless of who they may be. Let's take an analogy I use with young couples in premarital counseling sessions concerning the subject of communication. I ask them, what's more important, the message that you intend to send or the message that's actually received? What do you think? Pick one of those two answers in your mind. And if you said the message that's actually received, then you are right. Because all of the best intentions in the world aren't worth a hill of beans unless the person that you are trying to communicate with receives the message that you intend to send to them, right? Maybe you've heard it. Perception is what? Reality. Yeah. So I say to a young couple, let's talk about the difference between two concepts. Let's call them acceptance versus approval. And let's say that one of you tries to send a message of non-approval of what the other person said or did. But instead, the message that is received is one of non-acceptance of who they are as a person. Well, that's a horse of a different color. Sure it is. So if we want to show respect to others, we better make sure that they're receiving a message of respect from us. We need to make sure that we're building as an undeniable foundation a sense of total acceptance for them as a person. And that way, when those inevitable times arise when we disapprove of what each other says or does, then we've got that foundation of acceptance that reminds them that what they're hearing from us is not about non-acceptance of them as a person, but just disapproval of what they said or did. To put it in Christian terms, we separate the sin from the sinner. And folks, that's what Jesus did. Let's take an eternal encounter that he had with a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. Folks, Jesus decides to take his disciples through an area along their journey one day that no self-respecting kosher Jewish boy would ever go through. It was a place called Samaria. And there he teaches them an unforgettable lesson. Basically, Jews and Samaritans, they mixed like oil and water. In other words, they did not mix. And yet, this is where Jesus takes them. Usually a Jew would skirt miles and miles around Samaria to avoid any contact with these half-breeds, half Jew and half Samaritan. So you can imagine the 12 were none too happy with the boss's decision. They'd been walking all morning. It was now about noon. And when they arrive outside of this town called Sychar, Jesus sits down by this old well. And he tells the boys to go into town to Burger King to pick up some lunch. And while resting there, a Samaritan woman, she comes to draw water at the well. And generally in that culture, a woman, she would come out early in the day, not at high noon, with her water jar to draw water. Oh, she must have ran out of water, right? Not likely. More than likely, this woman, from the context we get in the story, lived out at the red light district at the edge of town. And she had come out to the well at a time when she could be assured that no other woman in the town would be there, because likely she would get rocks thrown at her. And we can be assured that, sort of like in baseball, that there would have been 3 strikes against this woman and Jesus ever having talked. Number 1, Jesus was a Jew and she was a Samaritan, and Jews and Samaritans simply did not talk to each other. Strike 1. Number 2, she was a woman and Jesus was a man, and in that culture, a man and a woman who were strangers simply did not talk. Strike 2. And 3, Jesus was a rabbi and she lived in the red light district. Strike number 3, they would not have talked. And yet, despite all of this, Jesus begins to speak to her. And then the long and the short of the conversation between them, folks, is that he reveals to her that though he knew that she had had 5 husbands in the past, and now she had a 6th guy, and though he showed her that he did not approve of such behavior, nonetheless, he made it absolutely clear that he totally accepted her. And folks, this literally blew her away. She'd never been treated with such respect before, not even from her fellow Samaritans. And folks, as I tell young couples about to be married, the respect that Jesus showed to that woman is a reminder of the dynamic power of acceptance. Because what happened next is unbelievable. Because of Jesus' kindness to her, this woman of the streets who had been disrespected her whole life, she literally becomes born again. She gets saved. And the next thing she does is even more amazing, because she runs back into town and she tells all of her other marginalized friends, the sinners that no one showed any respect to, and she brings them out to meet Jesus. And they have a revival, I imagine. And they get saved too. And folks, what Jesus models for us about the difference between acceptance and approval is all about what a dynamic thing respecting others can be as we seek to be witnesses for Christ in the Douglas and Saugatuck communities. No, we may not always agree sometimes with how others live their lives around us, but we can be the sweet aroma of Christ. We can be salt and light. As Paul himself says in Colossians, let your conversations be always full of grace, seasoned as with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And as Peter reminds us, live such good lives among the unbelievers that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that He visits you. Yeah. Like Aretha sang, all people need is just a little bit of respect. And when we show it to fellow sinners, because after all, the ground's all level at the foot of the cross, right? That becomes attractive. I mean, isn't that the kind of church that we want to be? We want to be that church that was there in Acts chapter 2, who was adding to their number daily those who were being saved. And why? Because of the magnetic, attractive power of their acceptance and their love for others. And yet, there's a third, final step in gaining respect from others. And I think it has to do with what we've just talked about. And that is that we gain RESPECT when we do our best in everything that we do. I like what comedian Steve Martin has to say about success in show business. He says, be so good that they can't ignore you. Yeah, like Paul said, live such good lives amongst unbelievers that they will see your good deeds and glorify God. And young people, the simple truth is that although slackers may be good buddies, they rarely win our respect. As Paul reminded his young spiritual son in the Lord, Timothy, do your best to be a worker that does not need to be ashamed. And he said elsewhere in Ephesians and Colossians, whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart as working for the Lord, not for men. And folks, Paul was reminding us, do your best in everything you do like you were doing it for Jesus, because then you'll never have to be ashamed. Yeah, shame above all things robs us of our self-respect, which in turn makes it difficult to win others for Christ. Yeah, conduct yourself professionally and hold yourself to high standards out in the community as representatives of Christ and of this church. And then see if folks don't respect you and the Lord that you serve, because they're watching, aren't they? How about we wrap up with this? It's said that legendary director and songwriter Oscar Hammerstein was once asked why he worked so hard. And he answered with a story of all things about seeing a photo of the Statue of Liberty's hairdo. Let's recall that the statue was made in 1886, long before they ever thought of having the capability of flying over the top to check on the old lady's due and the sculptor's work. I mean, why would anyone spend such time working on the top of the head of a 180-foot statue that no one would ever see? But could it be that Frederick Bartholdi, the Frenchman who made it, knew that liberty was grand and glorious, and he wasn't willing to do a half-hearted job? And so Hammerstein realized that if Bartholdi could do his work with excellence for the concept of liberty, then he'd do his music with the same level of attention, and so should we. Outside of this building and inside as well, with excellence, so that we earn the respect of all people who come within our doors. Because after all, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression, do you? Folks, earning the respect of others is tough stuff. The very beginning of Jesus' ministry, even he was disrespected. But there are three simple things each of us can do to win the respect of others. First, respect yourself by living out a life of integrity and honor. Secondly, respect others. Even when you disagree with them, show them grace and love and acceptance. And finally, third, do your best in everything you do. Be a worker who does not need to be ashamed, who earns others, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, for Christ's sake, because others are watching. Let's pray. Father, help us to be the kind of people who have self-respect, who respect others, and who are respected by others, that we might be your people. Amen.